Good afternoon, everyone from Evanston, Illinois. My name is Virginia Lee, and I am on faculty at Garrett in the field of Christian education, and I'm Director of Deacon Studies. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this second event in a series of events to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Order of Deacons in the United Methodist Church. This celebration is a collaboration of Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary, the Deacon Order Chairs Planning Group, and the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry. I want to remind you that there will be a worship service this Saturday as a part of this ongoing celebration that has been coordinated by Monica Childers and that will include deacons from across the connection. And then there will be a social justice panel on Saturday, April the 24th. More information about these events are available on the Garrett website. I also want to take just a minute to thank some of the persons who've made these events possible. Special thanks to all those members of the Deacon Order Chairs Planning Group, one of whom is with us today, Leo Yates. Thanks to the Garrett Communications Office and Shane Nichols, and to the Garrett Connectional Learning and Dr. Mark Teasdale. I especially want to thank Daniel Skelton, who will be our webinar support person this afternoon. We appreciate him and all that he has done and is doing right this minute to make this event possible. Just a couple of logistical things. Deacon Leo Yates is providing sign language interpretation for us. And so to best see Leo, you should choose the speaker view in the little box at the top right-hand corner of your screen. We hope to have time after Dr. Crain's presentation this afternoon for some questions. And so if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And I will be moderating those questions. This presentation is being recorded, and later this month, after all the events are over, we'll post those videos, and everyone who registered will receive a link to those videos. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce my former colleague and my friend, Reverend Dr. Margaret Crain. She was one of those persons who was ordained a deacon in 1997, the year that the first deacons in full connection were ordained. She served churches in Missouri and Georgia as a Christian educator for 20 years before she joined the faculty at Garrett in 1998 as a professor in Christian education and as the first director of deacon studies. Many of us know her for her books written about deacons, the first one being A Deacon's Heart, the new United Methodist Diaconate, which was published in 2001 and co-authored with Jack Seymour. Her second book, The United Methodist Deacon, Ordained to Word, Service, Compassion, and Justice, was published in 2014. And she's just completed her third deacon book. And this one narrates the history of the United Methodist Church's shift to ordaining deacons in 1996, tracing both the political realities and the theological foundations for that reordering of ministry. The name of this book is Advancing the Mission, the Order of Deacon in the United Methodist Church, and it will be released by Foundry Books in early summer. She will be telling some of that history this afternoon, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I have enjoyed hearing it. I am very pleased to present to you my deacon colleague, Reverend Dr. Margaret Crain.
Thanks, Virginia. I'm excited to share this story. I also want to thank Dean Tron from Garrett and President Vieira, both of whom have supported this event for us and and made it possible for this to happen. I need to thank Dr. Kathy Armistead, who is the one who said, you need to write a book about this. And I managed to get it done. Daniel Smith and the Steinberg Library, who provided through this whole pandemic all the historic documents I needed. I could just write to Daniel and he would find them for me and send them to me. And there's no way this would have happened without Daniel Smith. And then I also need to thank the 35 people that I interviewed for the project, most of whom were part of the earliest beginnings of this story. So why did I take on this project? Well, because I'm convinced that the United Methodist Deacon is the most complete version of diaconia in Western Christianity. We come the closest to being a, quote, full and equal order, to use the phrase coined by James Barnett. In the UMC, our education is parallel to that required of elders. We're full members of the annual conference. We kind of represent half of the mission of the church, which is for the transformation of the world half. So I really wanted to tell the story of how this remarkable thing happened. It all turned out to be a bit more complex than I expected, but what an amazing story it is. And the book, which will be published this summer by the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, got the name Advancing the Mission, the Order of Deacon in the United Methodist Church, because I do believe that you have to consider what is the mission of the church when you decide what kind of leadership you need. I knew that the 1996 General Conference was difficult to achieve, but I really had no idea how long it took or what sacrifices and political savvy were required, nor did I understand what it really meant. I was a diaconal minister in '96, and when I heard it had passed at General Conference, I, like many others, urgently wanted to know if we would be entitled to use the title Reverend. I thought it was about the church's recognition that my call to ministry as a Christian educator is worthy of ordination. And it is about that, but much more. As Dr. Nancy Lynn Westfield said, it felt like the church finally catching up to my call. But it's actually much broader. It's about leaders who help the church to join God's mission in the world, an incredible, radical move for our corporate, hierarchical, political bureaucracy. So I was ordained in 1997, as Virginia said, in North Georgia with the first class of diaconal ministers. And Garrett's president, Neil Fisher, was encouraged by Linda. You know, I've got Neil, I'm sorry, I've got your name spelled wrong. But he was encouraged by Linda Vogel and the academic dean, Jack Seymour, to figure out a way to respond to the action of the 1996 General Conference. And in 1998, I became that first director of deacon studies at Garrett. I really had a lot to learn. As my understanding grew more complex and nuanced, I became interested in how it happened. How could such a good thing happen? So this afternoon, I'm going to tell you in some detail about 3 segments of this story. The 1992 to 96 ministry study, which proposed diaconal ministry, is the first one. The second one is the near miss in 1992, when a proposal failed by 2 votes, and the decision in 1996 that approved the new order of deacon, eliminated the transitional deacon, and instituted commissioning for those who are provisionally approved for ordination. It's a long story, and it moves constantly toward a broader ecclesiology and asks these questions. Why does the church exist? What's the mission of the church? How can the church join in the Missio Dei? And what kind of leadership is needed to accomplish its purposes? So woven throughout this history are issues related to the meaning of ordination, which are not resolved 25 years later, History is also linked to the role of women in the church, and it reveals systemic racism and white privilege too. These things are the not yet of the order of deacon today. So I hope to celebrate the already and do some naming of the not yet this afternoon. Of course, I could start with Acts 6, but you all already know that story. I see three primary themes as the church develops its structure and leadership for mission: the ecumenical consensus, leadership for the ministry of all baptized Christians in their daily lives, and credentialed leaders for the church's mission in the world. So some of our earliest credentialed leaders for that mission were part of the deaconess movement. It arose in response to the age of industrialization and urbanization, and people in cities were really suffering. In the US, Chicagoan Lucy Ryder Meyer was convinced that these women who served in urban communities needed training and credentialing. So she started the Chicago Training School. I've looked at its curriculum and it's very similar to today's MDiv. It has Bible, history of Christianity, theology, Christian education, but also nursing and nutrition. This is its building. That's a pretty significant building. Keep in mind that women could not vote or be ordained in these days. They had limited options for expressing a call to ministry. Lucy Ryder Meyer fought for recognition for deaconesses, and in 1888, the Methodist Episcopal Church General Conference approved the office of deaconess. By 1900, that's 12 years later, about 2,000 Protestants were deaconesses in the US. 1,200 of them were Methodist. And of course, we still have deaconesses. In the Philippines, for instance, Harris Memorial College has been training deaconesses for decades. And I'm proud to say its president now is Dr. Christina Manyabat, a graduate of Garrett's religious education program. Credentialing people to address the needs of people is one of the streams that we're running through the church and moving toward that decision in 1996. A second stream feeding into the decision of 1996 comes from ecumenical discussions of a permanent diaconate, which arose on the heels of World War II. As the concentration camps were liberated, it really became impossible for some to ignore the silence and sometimes complicity of the European churches in the Nazi atrocities. So as World War II drew to a close, a group of Christian clergymen, the majority of whom were Catholic, imprisoned in cell block 26 of Dachau concentration camp for their resistance to Nazis, began to secretly discuss, at considerable risk to themselves, some ways to revitalize the church in the wake of that devastating war. The restoration of the diaconate seemed like the answer. And both Protestants and Catholics embraced the idea. The Vatican II Council in the early 1960s called for a permanent diaconate. The last I heard, the Archdiocese of Chicago had about 500 deacons. The document that came from the World Council of Churches discussions is called Baptism Eucharist Ministry. It's especially relevant for us because it supported a permanent distinctive diaconate. It declared, deacons represent to the church its calling as servant in the world. By struggling in Christ's name with the myriad needs of societies and persons, deacons exemplify the interdependence of worship and service in the church's life. So ecumenical support of the ordained deacon was another stream feeding toward the 1996 General Conference division. And the third theme playing a role in that decision is connected to my field, religious education. The Sunday school movement had begun in John Wesley's time, and in the 20th century, religious education as a profession emerges. By the late 1950s, both the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church had institutionalized their credentialing of educators. So even before the merger of 68, the Methodist Church's Board of Education had a staff member, R. Harold Hips, known as R, who worked with educators who were seeking certification. Hips heard the struggles of these people to find employment with security, benefits, and other issues of justice. So he also started the Christian Educators Fellowship, a national organization which would resource, advocate for certification, and provide a network for Christian educators. So when the United Methodist Church was formed in 1968, it included, surprisingly, a new office called the Consecrated Lay Worker. Notice this is a worker, not a minister, lay, not ordained. And by the way, at this point, the discipline said that the term minister was reserved for ordained persons. The Consecrated Lay Worker provided denominational recognition for professionals employed by the church, such as Christian educators or musicians. This office embodied all three of the themes that I've been naming that feeds toward 1996: credentialed leaders for the church's mission, the ecumenical consensus, and leadership for the ministry of all baptized Christians. What was to prove important for the church's permanent diaconate in 1996 action, a young woman named Rena Yoakum was interested in becoming a consecrated lay worker. Rena had graduated from Central Methodist College in Fayette, Missouri in 1965 and was employed by a church in Kansas City to lead its Christian education program. She decided to take more courses so she could meet the standards to be certified as an associate in Christian education. So she traveled to several Methodist graduate schools to complete the requirements and was certified in 1970. And in 1971, she was consecrated as a lay worker. Thus, Yoakum was taking courses, applying, and being affirmed for these specialized, non-ordained denominational credentials during the first quadrennium of the new United Methodist denomination. In 1972, the new General Board of Higher Education and Ministry was authorized by the General Conference. Kansas East named Rena Yoakum to their pool of persons eligible to serve on the general agencies. Rena didn't expect to be tapped because the Kansas East Conference delegation had a clergyman from her conference at the top of their list. But as it turned out, he was elected as a bishop by the jurisdictional conference later that summer. Rena Yoakum's name rose to the top of the list, and she was elected to the new GBHEM when the agency was organized in the fall of 1972. When the board convened, Rena was assigned to the Division of Lay Ministry. The inclusion of a certified and newly consecrated lay worker on that first denominational body responsible for administering those standards proved providential. Yoakum's presence would have a big impact in the board and the Ministry Study Commission of 72 to 76, which proposed the new diaconal ministry. Now, United Methodists like me are kind of inclined to see this sort of thing as the work of the Holy Spirit. The 1972 General Conference authorized a study of ministry commission. Pretty much every General Conference has, by the way, but so the 1972, and their instructions were to report back to General Conference in 1976. This particular commission became known as the Canon Commission, after Bishop William Ragsdale Cannon, who chaired it, and he was quite a character. This group agreed first that all Christians are called to ministry by their baptism. This was controversial, believe it or not. When the commission then agreed to consider a permanent diaconate the next spring, two people were added to the commission as consultants. One was Rena Yoakum, representing the Division of Lay Ministry from GBHEM. The other was Betsy Ewing, who was the staff person for deaconesses at the General Board of Ministries. And Rena's compelling question to the commission was, this is really important. She said to them, Is there no authentication for the form of ministry that I do? Well, they listened. But in order to avoid using the term deacon, they created an adjectival form, diaconal. This would still be a consecrated lay office, but it used a form of the word deacon, quite a change from worker. The work of the Canon Commission was approved by General Conference in 76, and diaconal ministry was born. And here's a picture of some of those early diaconal ministers. Aren't those fun? Between 1976 and 88, diaconal ministry became pretty well established. First, the division of lay ministry was replaced by the division of diaconal ministry at GBHEM. It paralleled the division of ordained ministry. Then Rosalie Bensinger was hired to replace R. Hips. She had a degree in Christian education from Garrett and Northwestern. She was a diaconal minister certified in CE. She was also president of Christian Educators Fellowship. Bensinger remembers that she was recruited to work toward a stronger diaconate in the UMC, and she would lead the division until 1994. Big job. Joaquin Garcia soon joined Bensinger. Later, Dr. Paul Van Buren came. They wrote guidelines for boards of ordained diaconal ministry. Yikes, I said the wrong word, diaconal ministry. Visited seminaries to meet with students and speak about professional certification and requirements for consecration as diaconal minister. And they generally promoted diaconal ministry. One major project they produced was this book, Called to Serve the United Methodist Diaconate. Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore, a diaconal minister, member of the faculty at the United Methodist Claremont School of Theology, was the primary author. Dr. Rosemary Skinner Keller, professor of religion and American culture at Garrett, and Dr. Gerald Mead, experienced ecumenical leader, also wrote some sections of the book. And this book was an important resource for discussion about the diaconate. So now we come to the momentous Quadrennium, 1988 to 92. In 1992, another ministry study commission recommended a permanent ordained deacon. Their report was submitted to the Council of Bishops. But the Council of Bishops didn't like the commission's report, so it sent a petition to the 1992 General Conference asking for the whole thing to be referred back to them, back to the Council of Bishops, making the work of the 88 to 92 commission moot. And the bishops proposed instead a consecrated lay deacon to replace the consecrated diaconal minister. So we come to the 1992 General Conference, and it's great drama. It began when Bishop Grove called the General Conference to order on the afternoon of May 15th, 1992. Before the body was that petition from the Council of Bishops to refer it all back to them. But before any action to refer, Ruth Doherty, a lay delegate from Eastern Pennsylvania who had chaired the study commission, was allowed to report on the commission's work. Doherty named the three principles that guided their work: a missional focus, the call to service for all baptized Christians, and the ecumenical consensus that there are three distinct ministries: deacon, elder, and bishop. You may notice, though, those are the same three primary issues that have connected to the diaconate all along. The commission had recommended a permanent ordained order of deacon and a single ordination for elders to word, sacrament, and order. So then, following the dinner break, Bishop Grove moved to the report of the Legislative Committee on Ordained and Diaconal Ministry. The chair was Dr. Dennis Campbell, Dean of the Duke Divinity School. The secretary was Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore. I owe my understanding of the 1992 near miss to Linda Marshall, who cheerfully and generously shared her memories with me. Linda Marshall was a diaconal minister delegate and a member of that legislative committee, and she was very frustrated. She remembered that Mary Elizabeth Moore was elected secretary and because of that was silenced during the legislative session. Linda says, so much of what she could have shared would have saved us so much time. That was an eye-opening experience in my naive world. Moore, along with Linda Marshall and others from the legislative committee, were on the platform when the report began. They had asked if they should get a reserve from their delegations to be seated in case a vote was taken, and Campbell had said no. So, because they were on the platform outside the bar of the conference, none of them could vote, and there was no one in their place at the tables and the floor. They were essentially disenfranchised. The plenary first voted to table the petition from the Council of Bishops to refer, which created a legislative space for the body to hear the legislative committee report. Campbell then testified that the committee worked long hours and labored diligently. The days in that committee room must have been very intense. Jack Harnish, an elder from Michigan who had joined the staff of GBHEM in 1993, called it a heated debate. Many in Louisville for the conference had followed the progress of petitions assigned to this committee quite eagerly, and it must have been very exhausting for everyone on the legislative committee. So the air in the convention center was very charged that night. Diaconal ministers were holding their breath and hoping the proposals would pass. Campbell first offered what he called 3 key petitions that represented the crux of the committee's work. The first was to create a new order of ordained deacon to take the place of diaconal ministers. Now, this was quite a change from the consecrated lay deacon proposed by the bishops this time. The second key proposal from the legislative committee eliminated the transitional ordination to deacon for elders. And the third key proposal was to make the deacons full clergy members of the annual conference, ordained to liturgy and service. Are you following me? Does any of that sound familiar? So the debate began. Doris Rudy, lay leader from Northern Illinois Conference, urged the General Conference to concur with the legislative committee. Rudy was a mover and shaker among lay delegates. Part of her argument for an ordained deacon was that a consecrated lay deacon might create an undesirable gradation of laity. As long as diaconal ministers or a consecrated lay deacon were defined as part of the lay representation in conferences, laity felt they were losing their voice. They certainly were losing some seats. Speeches against the proposals argued that the issues needed more study, same old, that this change would be a break with tradition and ordination should be limited to the traditional priestly ministries of word, sacrament, and order. They also argued passionately that in Methodism, those who were ordained had always agreed to be sent on behalf of the mission of the church. Here's a quote: I submit that itinerancy is not, as the majority proposal assumes, merely a thing indifferent, an administrative baggage that we can now discard for the sake of the creation of this new order. This is what is at stake in the decision you will make, proclaimed Lawrence McCleskey, clergy from Western North Carolina. We'll hear from him again in the 1996 deliberations. Remember that name. Then the discussion turned to the meaning of liturgy and service. Mary Elizabeth, finally allowed to speak, said, liturgy and service go deep into the history of the Christian church. The early church had bishops, presbyters, and deacons. The deacon's role was to assist the presbyter and bishop in the liturgy and to lead the community in acts of service in the world. After some more parliamentary maneuvering, and I get a big kick out of all this parliamentary stuff, I don't know about y'all, Reverend Kelly Bender spoke, and Bender and Rena Yoakum were both from Kansas East Conference. Bender said, to suggest that the legislative committee recommendation has somehow emerged without foresight and care is unwarranted. It is an outgrowth of 20 years of dialogue, reflection, and discernment within the United Methodist Church and the Ecumenical Church. I believe the Holy Spirit has been present and participant in the legislative committee recommendation. I believe the recommendation reflects a clear, consistent theology of ordination, a clear, consistent structuring of ministry, and I believe it will empower ministry. The debate continued for quite a while. Linda Marshall, there she is, remembers, these are her words. When questions were asked, Dennis would have this kind of chaotic response, and he would flail his arms and would look around as if, is there anybody who could answer this? Here was Mary Elizabeth ready to answer, and he would just keep moving on and try to bumble his way through an answer. It was a very effective method. Campbell made it sound like we didn't have a clue what was going on. Mary Elizabeth could have carefully answered and dispelled all the anxiety. That was my first true experience of being totally silenced and in despair. Ultimately, the question that was put to a vote was an amendment to delete the words by ordination and for the ministry of liturgy and service. A yes vote would essentially overturn the recommendation from the legislative committee. And the vote to delete was yes, 480, no, 478. It failed by only 2 votes. According to Mary Elizabeth, when that decision was announced, there was a collective groan. Because General Conference doesn't normally have such close decisions, there was a collective groan. The establishment of a permanent ordained deacon failed by 2 votes in 92. More than 2 delegates were on the platform who would have voted yes, but they were outside the bar of the conference. So then the motion to refer was brought off the table and the whole matter went to the Council of Bishops. Understandably, those who had favored the new ordained deacon were disappointed and angry. General Secretary of GBHEM, Roger Ireson, said that was felt very, very deeply. After the General Conference of 1992, I had diaconals crying everywhere. They were coming to us. They were in tears. They felt that once again, they had been put down by the church. Their ministry had not been recognized or validated by the church. And you'll notice that was the question that Rena Yoakum had posed to that commission back in 1974 or 5. Linda Marshall and others realized they needed to be more savvy about the legislative process. They needed to recruit more allies like Kelly Bender and Doris Rudy. They needed to organize before the election of legislative committee officers. They must work with the agenda committee to put their legislation in a good place for fruitful debate, and they were determined to be better prepared. So this is the big turning point. The 1992 to 96 Quadrennium brought a transition in GBHEM staff. Rosalie Bensinger retired in 1994, and Jimmy Carr was hired to take her place as head of the Division of Diaconal Ministry. What a gift Jimmy was. At about that same time, Reverend Jack Harnish became the new head of the Division of Ordained Ministry. Jack, had argued on the floor of general conferences against the permanent ordained deacon, but Jimmy had supported it. Jack was from Michigan. Jimmy was from Mississippi. They represented 2 jurisdictions, 2 different cultures, 2 different parts of the church. But they forged a friendship that reached across that chasm. Here's Jack Harnish's description of the situation. When I came to interview for the position of Associate General Secretary for the Division of Ordained Ministry, There was concern expressed about how I would relate to the then separate division of diaconal ministry. Coming into that role, the tension between the two sides of the Crain building was palpable. The two staffs were hardly speaking to each other. Ordained ministry was on one side of the central vestibule, and diaconal ministry was on the other, and the land between was no man's land, with Roger Ireson upstairs trying to bring peace to the troops down below. I have always said Roger deserves immense credit for managing all that. And the fact that Jimmy arrived soon after I did gave us an opportunity to bridge the great divide. So a lot of other stuff had happened by 92-96 Quadrennium. With that deft leadership of Rosalie, Paul, and Joaquin, standards and processes were much more clearly defined. Diaconal ministers were now consecrated in the same service where deacons and elders were ordained. MEF funds were available for diaconal ministers. Psychological exams were required for all. There was a candidacy process. Nan Zoller gathered a group of diaconal ministers and began a grassroots campaign to keep the conversation going through the Quadrennium. They just took it into their own hands. They put together a newsletter called Colleagues in Dialogue and sent it to bishops, diaconal ministers, General Conference delegates, and influencers. At least twice a year, volunteers would come together to lick and stick the newsletter for mailing. I remember reading it eagerly every time it arrived at my office in Columbia, Missouri. A wide variety of people wrote for it, and it went into the mailboxes of many, many people in the church. Colleagues in Dialogue made a real impact. The work to prepare for 1996 really began immediately, and it's got 4 major players in it. The first thing is that the whole issue had been referred to the Council of Bishops, and they worked hard to prepare a report recommending an ordained deacon as well as an elder. They also instigated conversations across the church and collected feedback. Second, the National Convocation of Diaconal Ministers was going to meet in October 1995, so the design team was busy with that. Eventually, the Diaconal Clearness Committee will be formed. I'll tell you about that, and then the Legislative Committee will meet. So in the 6 months between October 1995 and April 1996, the pace became very swift. Do you hear that? It's between October and General Conference in April. Just a few months. The GBHEM Board of Directors met October 5th to 8th, early October, and Bishop William Oden came to present the Council of Bishops ministry report to them. Immediately after that, the Southeast Jurisdiction Boards of Diaconal Ministry met for training and received a summary of the report. That's October 9th and 10th. Following that, the Tennessee Conference Board of Diaconal Ministry, chaired by Barbara Garcia, began preparing petitions to the General Conference, which would eliminate the dual ordination for elders and replace it with consecration for a probationary period for both deacons and elders. So that would be different from what the bishops were submitting. And the Council of Bishops were going to meet the first week of October to finalize their report and send it to the 1996 General Conference. So when about 500 diaconal ministers gathered in Atlanta in late October, they were pretty excited. It was beginning to look like their ministry would be recognized more fully. And this convocation timing is going to prove really critical. According to Linda Marshall, the goal of the convocation was to deeply explore who we were as diaconal ministers so that we could better articulate why we felt it was important to be ordained as deacons. And of course, they had been planning the program of that convocation through the whole Quadrennium. On Thursday, October 26, 1995, as the convocation began, the group was welcomed by Roger Ireson. Next, Mary Elizabeth Moore spoke on theological dimensions for diaconal ministry. And then Bishop Oden had the floor for an hour and presented the ministry study. So the group had this theological and biblical dimensions of diaconia in mind. And in the midst of that, they learned about the bishop's report to the General Conference. Many were pretty concerned about the proposal because it didn't discontinue the transitional deacon. Conversations around the conference were intense and frustrated. It was pretty clear that this proposal would create a second-class category for deacons. I was there. Following the evening session, Associate General Secretary Jimmy Carr invited everyone who wanted to talk more about the ministry study to come to a certain room, and many of us came. Mary Elizabeth says, the reaction of the diaconal ministers was huge and negative, not to the whole report, but to the two types of deacon continuing, because they recognized that if we went that way as a denomination, we would be diminishing the deacon in such a way that the vision for mission could not be lived out. I had been asked, this is Mary Elizabeth speaking, she had been asked to convene the meeting. What came out of the meeting was that the diaconal ministers did not want to be silent. They wanted to speak out in a way that could be considered and heard at the next General Conference. And because this was already October and legislation would have to go in right away, the group decided that we would act. A small team would give leadership to that work. A team was appointed. Mary Elizabeth was appointed chair. That happened on the spot. Jimmy did it. The convocation participants, agitated and anxious from their action of the night before, spent Friday dispersed into Atlanta in service projects. They were doing what they believed God had called them to do. Then the final day of the convocation celebrated their calling to service. Diaconal Minister Nancy Lynn Westfield preached, "Remember Jesus," which is exactly what Mary Elizabeth invited us to do this morning. A deeply meaningful hand-washing ritual with bowls of water at each table was led by diaconal ministers Joaquin and Barbara Garcia, Paul and Corinne Van Buren, and Jimmy and Joy Carr, all leaders in the denomination. And as we washed each other's hands, we were blessed and prayed for by those at our table. So Mary Elizabeth and her small group began to work together on a response to the bishop's ministry study. Anita Wood was part of the committee, and she remembers, besides preparing a response to the bishop's proposal, we had to develop links in our annual conference to support it. The board staff had to stay out of it. They had been directed not to be involved. Here's how Mary Elizabeth describes their process. We set it up right away as a clearness committee. We began our meetings with prayer and time for silence. In our meetings, when we got to a stuck place where we were trying to figure out the best way, we would just pause and be silent, sometimes for a few minutes. And as someone became ready to speak, we would go back to the question at hand. That was remarkable, and it helped us to remain centered and focused on God and God's leadership. It also helped us to hear each other well. Linda Marshall told me it was a phenomenal experience. Moore guided the group with a sure hand. She said, "We decided very early that the bishop's proposal was actually very well done. We saw ourselves as improving upon it rather than contradicting it." And she also had learned from her previous experiences with General Conference that the legislation needed to be thorough and detailed. The conference was not equipped to deal with big ideas unless they were accompanied by all the disciplinary changes necessary. Mary Elizabeth had what she called a come to Jesus moment. She says, "I was sitting at the table. It was 2 a.m. I was deeply in the weeds working on the particularities of the legislation. And I said to myself, Mary Elizabeth, you're either going to do this all the way or this isn't going to be effective. I stopped and prayed. And what came to me is, you need to give it everything you've got. It was my calling. I worked on that legislation all night for multiple nights, and then I would send it to the team. One decision they made has had long-term repercussions and is not yet resolved. That's the question of sacraments. According to Linda Marshall, the Clearness Committee was trying to clarify what were the strong talking points and what were negotiation points. Their process identified that sacraments were one of the things we could give on if that was going to prevent us from becoming an order. The Clearness Committee agreed, however, that the deacon must be distinct from the elder. If elders continued to be ordained first as deacons, it would detract from those called to the ministry of the deacon. Their single ordination would look like it was partial. This would not be open to negotiation. The Clearness Committee submitted about 30 petitions, which are listed in the Advanced DCA as proposed changes to the ministry study. That heading was important. The Clearness Committee did not want to be seen as disrespectful. They wanted their proposals to be seen as supporting the work of the bishops, but offering clarifications. Each petition was carefully crafted and amended the bishop's legislation, retaining as much language as possible. Now, they deleted ordination as a deacon from the section on orders, and here's how the argument went. One, the probationary status was not an order, never had been. Second, the original order of deacon as it was conceived and practiced by the early church was not a stepping stone toward the ordination of a priest. Three, the Methodist Protestant Church, one of our predecessor denominations, did not have a probationary deacon. Four, the Evangelical United Brethren, also a predecessor denomination, did not have a probational deacon. And in the 1970s and 80s, the UMC became clearer about our theological understandings and our affirmation that we believe in one baptism. Similarly, there's no theological rationale for dual ordination. The leadership of the Clearness Committee was well prepared for General Conference when it convened in Denver in April of 1996, and perhaps the time was right. Joaquin Garcia calls it a kairos moment for the deacon. Rena Yoakum wrote, "There have been times in church history when the sacramental ministry of the church in the sanctuary was not sufficient. The church needed to be seen out in the world. At the end of the 20th century, there was so much upheaval, a change in world powers, the fall of the Soviet Union, the many wars, homelessness, migration of peoples from country to country. This was the time when we needed this expression of the church, and the church needed to authenticate this ministry in the world." So the stage is set for the 1996 General Conference. The bishops were given time early in the agenda to make a report on their ministry study. It was April 18th, a Thursday. And then they sent the delegates out to, quote, listen for the guidance of the Spirit and ideas of colleague delegates. As the delegates left the hall to discuss that report, they were singing, "Here I am, Lord." And the summary of those discussions then was available to the Ministry Legislative Committee when it began its work. Linda Marshall, this time, was an observer. This meant she could sit in on the discussions of the Legislative Committee and help strategize or provide resources. But she had been chair of the GBHAM Division of Diaconal Ministry. She was a member of the Clearness Committee, and she brought a lot of expertise to the room. Linda says, "There were still some anxious moments for sure, but it was a whole different experience than 92. We had learned how to talk across the aisle. We were careful we were not stuck up on the podium for votes. Got our talking point handout to all delegates at certain times. We did a lot more behind the scenes conversation than we had done before. And we found allies like Kelly Bender, who said, "I believe in the role of the deacon. I will help you get other advocates like me." When the legislative committee convened, it elected Sandy Lutz, a laywoman from East Ohio, as its chair. Sandy was an experienced delegate. Her strategy was to encourage people to talk it out. This time, supporters of the Clearness Committee proposal were able to speak much more freely in the discussion. Sandy remembers the group of diaconal ministers who were there to observe and support, like Linda Marshall. She remembers that they were good listeners, patient folks, people like Linda. They were always checking. If it got late at night, they would be there with cookies or something cold to drink. All of that made it possible for others to do the job that they could do. It was a real gift. The bishop's ministry study had come with hundreds of petitions to bring the discipline into compliance with their proposal. The Tennessee Conference Board submitted some amendments, and the Diaconal Clearness Committee also had prepared nearly 30 petitions with their proposed amendments. With so much legislation to consider, the legislative committee decided to divide into 10 subgroups, or perhaps Sandy decided that. Barbara Garcia was in the group considering the petitions related to probationary membership. Also in the group were Jack Harnish, Lovett Weems, who was then president of St. Paul School of Theology, and Larry Goodpaster, a delegate from Mississippi who is now a bishop. They determined that using consecration as the liturgical act for entrance into this relationship was going to be confusing, although several petitions had used that term. Diaconal ministers, church buildings, and bishops were consecrated, but what to call it? Sometime very late on Friday night, Garcia's group chose commissioning to designate probationary members in the process for ordination. But nobody ever doubted we were doing the right thing, says Sandy. When it came time for the legislative committee to report to the plenary about the ministry legislation, the General Conference was abuzz and very distracted, not only about this legislation, but also because a group of bishops who came to be known as the Denver 15 had released a statement in which they urged the church to cease its condemnation of homosexuality. This caused an enormous stir and dominated the conversations in the hallways. Emotions were running very high. The debate about human sexuality had been going on since the 1992 General Conference and often would eclipse other issues. Perhaps the 76 General Conference had so easily approved the diaconal ministry because that year the more controversial issue was sexuality. Potentially 1996 was no different. And I also need to remind us, most of us are probably Methodists, so we know this, but the General Conference is very political, but it's also deeply spiritual. United Methodists seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit, even while they're strategizing and organizing and arguing to get their petitions approved. The important proposal for reordering ministry were introduced into a very complicated emotional, spiritual, and cultural setting in the middle of the second week. The ministry-related legislative items were on the agenda for Wednesday evening, April 24th. The committee had prepared a document for delegates with a brief summary of their work. Lutz pointed out that the legislative committee had parted ways with the bishops by supporting the petitions brought by the Diaconal Clearness Committee that would provide parallel paths leading to single ordination to each of two distinct orders. Single ordination for elders would create parity between the orders as well as distinct identities. Sandy concluded her explanation with these words: God's Spirit right now seems to be moving among us, gently nudging and encouraging us to take heart, breathing life into the dry bones and calling us to trust new models and new understandings of ministry. She had awakened in the middle of the night with that image of the dry bones coming to life. It felt to her like a powerful metaphor for the action that the delegates were about to take. The first calendar item requiring a vote concerned a single ordination for either order, essentially eliminating the traditional practice of sequential ordination for elders. This was going to be the ultimate test for the new ordained deacon. Very controversial, but at the heart of the concern of diaconal ministers. Larry Goodpastor, the elder from Mississippi Conference, Jimmy Carr's conference, I think that's no accident, presented this piece of legislation. Goodpastor was a shrewd choice. He was an elder, he was elected bishop in 2000, from the Southeast jurisdiction, an area of the church that tended to be traditional. Goodpastor said, "The act of ordination sets persons apart for various ministries. One of our questions is, why is it necessary to set persons apart twice?" Predictably, J. Lawrence McCleskey, the clergy delegate from Western North Carolina, was quickly recognized by Bishop Talbert, and he raised the same objection that he had in 1992. If we adopt the proposal of the committee, we will depart from almost 1,700 years of tradition, which has characterized most of Christendom, he said. He also claimed that ever since Francis Asbury, American Methodists had done it that way. And so do some of our ecumenical connections, especially Roman Catholics. So he offered an amendment to return to sequential ordination for elders. Mary Elizabeth, who was seated with her delegation this time and not disenfranchised by sitting on the stage, was ready. She said, "I think the question before us tonight is the question of where we are going and where is God calling us into this future." She continued, "We've had study team after study team. Almost every time they've brought the recommendation of two distinct ordinations, one to deacon, one to elder. Last time that particular recommendation came out of legislative committee and was defeated on the floor of this general conference by 2 votes. We might ask ourselves, where is God calling us into the future? What vessels do we need as we journey beyond the edge of the map?" Ultimately, the crucial vote, was on McCleskey's amendment that would have made the work of the Clearness Committee moot. The vote was 24 to support his amendment, 224 yes, and 710 no. The amendment failed, soundly defeated. The supporters of the new deacon must have heaved a huge sigh of relief. The 1996 General Conference was going to support them. Yeah, Leo. Whew. The work of the bishops, along with the revisions from the Diaconal Clearness Committee, were strongly upheld. The new order of ordained deacon would be full members of the annual conference, but sacraments were reserved for elders. Elders would no longer be deacons. This was a huge shift from the 70s that happened between 1976 and 1996. This narrative encompasses evolving answers to the questions I raised at the beginning. Why does the church exist? What is the mission of the church? How can the church join in the Missio Dei? What kind of leadership is needed to accomplish these purposes? So where are we now? Well, it's all ready, but it's not yet. We've come a long way since 1968. We were deeply divided over the war then in Vietnam. The US was still racially segregated. The UMC was especially segregated. But look at these pictures of the uniting conference. Just look carefully. Who's there? We see a few people of color, a couple of women, but nearly everyone is male, white, and bald. White privilege was reigning supreme. So I see some unresolved issues still. And I'm going to speak very briefly about these, and perhaps you'll want to raise some questions when I'm done. First of all, unconscious sexism really limits deacons, mixed in with the misunderstanding of service. I see it regularly in DCOM and Board of Ordained Ministry meetings that if a young man comes who is called to the order of deacon, he's encouraged to be an elder. Not always, but way too much. And sometimes it's pretty subtle. Also, this business of who do we serve? We serve God, not the senior pastor or the church. Now, I'm putting it very baldly, but there's some of that kind of going on subtly in what happens. Secondly, lack of awareness of systemic racism. Same thing. People of color are strongly encouraged to be elders, not deacons, regardless of what their call is. And I know it has to do with the perception that deacons are lesser. So that's a very complex issue. Third, there's a lack of financial support for missional ministries that address the transformation of the world through compassion and justice. There's just no one has the imagination to think, oh, let's support a deacon who can go do that thing. Deacons have to find an NGO or start one of their own or something in order to do those missional ministries way too often. Fourth, I think it's really important that we realize deacons are still not a critical mass in the church. There's simply not enough of us. And consequently, we're just not seen. No one thinks of us so often. I remember attending a training thing online where they were talking about you could do this and this and this and this with your congregation, and no one ever thought that a deacon could be helpful. It was only about elders. And finally, in this last idea, the lack of missional imagination in the Council of Bishops, I actually have to give credit to Jerome Del Pino for that. He was a former secretary of GBHEM who did not support the order of deacon. But here's what he said. Bishops don't want to have anything to do with empowering and enabling the annual conference to provide enough money to ensure that deacons are doing justice. I wish every conference could claim they've got deacons who are assigned to city councils or state legislatures. I wish every conference could say we've got deacons appointed to be in the public square and in the centers of power where the questions of justice are addressed. What a great vision. And I'm grateful to Dr. Del Pino for helping me to think about that. So the unresolved issues also relate to ordination, and one is about itineracy. The latest ministry study, it was asked to write a theology of ordination, and I think they did a great job of it. There's some wonderful language about deacons in it. The report says that deacons, this is a quote, engage the world with a heart of compassion and a prophetic longing for God's justice to prevail, unquote. And the report states strongly that sacraments are linked to ordination, and since deacons are ordained, they should be authorized for sacramental presidency. But then when they, later in the document, they begin to link full conference membership to itineracy, we may have a problem. So deacons, get involved in the discussion. As I see it, I've itinerated as I responded to God's call. We have to help the church to see that. So I'm going to close. How's my time? Oh boy. Okay, I'm only 6 minutes over. I want to close with a beautiful dream poem written by Rena Yoakum in 1991 for her Doctor of Ministry degree. It's a riff on the I Have a Dream speech of Martin Luther King Jr., and I think you'll love it. Here it is. I have a dream that someday someone will announce that they want to become a deacon, and the whole church will cheer and celebrate. I have a dream that someday people won't have to ask, what's a deacon? How come you're not a real minister? Could you be if you wanted to? I dream of a day when we won't need deacon under glass. We won't have to be inspected or dissected or suspected. It will be a day when a deacon doesn't need an adjective. I dream of a time when there is no ranking of ministries or ministers, no ranking of gender or race, only the belief that we are one in Christ Jesus. I dream of a time when the basin and towel speaks as boldly about ministry as does the chalice. I dream of a day when deacons can be seen as caregivers, demonstrating love and concern for all and calling the church into active involvement with the hurts and needs of humanity. I dream of a time when deacons are expected to be advocates, proclaiming justice, assisting the poor, the needy, and challenging the church to change systems which oppress. I dream of a time when deacons witness to the power of the Spirit as teachers and evangelists, inviting people to become disciples, nurturing them in faith. I dream of a day when deacons, lifting the global dimensions of the Christian faith, model the link between those gathered for worship and those scattered in the world. I dream of a time when the deacon so embodies servanthood that the people remember their call from the servant Christ. Amen. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret Ann. I know that there is that you have a lot more that you could have told us, so we will have to get the book when it's published so that we can learn more. We do have a few questions. Let me just a couple of questions I can answer very quickly. One is whether there'd be access to the recordings, and yes, they will after April 24th when all the events are over. We everyone who's registered for the events will get a link to the recording. So yes, they will be made available. And then someone had asked about whether the logo, 25th anniversary logo, was available. I think all of you got my email for with the registration. Email me about that if you'd like to know more. So let me well, and Margaret Ann, this would be a quick question. Folks are asking where they can find a copy of that I Dream that you read at the end.
It's actually in the book. Rena gave me permission to put it in the book. So when the book comes out, or else you can try to get her DMin thesis from interlibrary loan.
Okay. Great. So a couple of questions. The first one says, given the wide variance of bishops' interpretation of deacons regarding appointments for ordination, is there a need for legislation per general conference to clarify? I guess I'm guessing that's related to how bishops interpret that they appoint persons.
Yeah.
And how and where they do.
Yeah, I imagine it is. I mean, in my connecting with various deacons around the connection, I know some have had a hard time convincing their bishop that whatever it is they're called to do is an appointable ministry. You know, my part of what I think about that, first of all, legislation, I don't know. I'm kind of done with the book of discipline getting fatter and fatter and trying to control every little thing. So there's that. But I also think part of the problem is that critical mass, that we are not a critical mass. So we're just not noticed. A lot of conferences have one or two deacons who are very visible, but they tend to be employed by the bureaucracy. They're working at the level of conference staff. And the deacons who are just out there doing these justice and compassion ministries are less visible because they're busy. They can't be at every meeting that ever happens. Having said all that, I just feel like the best solution will be recruit more deacons. I've written this in my other book. I said, every congregation ought to have a deacon, and some congregations should have 20 deacons. There are lots of laity who are very serious about their call to ministry from their baptism. And I think if we would start suggesting to more of those people, have you ever thought about ordination as a deacon? Here's how you can do it. We have a deacon, a man in the congregation in Evanston that I used to go to, who's a veterinarian. But he is clearly called to ministry, and he's been going and taking a few classes, and I think he's on the track to becoming an ordained deacon. Who is there? Look around, suggest it, just ask them, have you ever considered God might be calling you to ordained ministry in the United Methodist Church? I think there are a lot more out there, and they just haven't been, the culture of call isn't strong enough, let me put it that way.
We have two questions I want to put together. That someone is wondering if lack of sacramental authority deters persons from the order, and or someone else has asked, do you think there'll come a time when deacons will have sacramental authority? I think you mentioned from the study what the latest study has said, but what do you think about those two?
I do think that is beginning to crack. We didn't have it, we haven't had it, and I was saying to Virginia earlier this afternoon, I feel like we've had to do contortions in order to find the language to explain why we don't have it, because ordination and sacraments have always gone together in the church, and I know there are some bishops who have been quite generous or grace-filled in granting sacramental authority to deacons, and others who have been at the other end of that continuum. But we'll have generations of bishops too, and I'm watching the elder who is appointed to the church I attend, who went to seminary alongside a lot of strong people who called to the order of deacon. And he is completely appreciative and understanding about the distinctiveness of the order of deacon, and works beautifully with our deacon, Debbie Tyree. Those elders are going to become bishops, and they'll be making the appointments, and things will change. It just is really slow in the church. And if you realize that way back in the 1940s, we were certifying people as Christian educators, it moved through that to the consecrated lay deacon, which was broader, and then to the diaconal minister, and then to the deacon in 96. And even in 96, I think our understanding of the deacon was narrower than it is now. The range of things that God has called people to as deacons, and that they have been appointed to by the church, is expanding, continuing to expand. And I give thanks for that. That is wonderful, wonderful news.
I have another where I'm kind of putting two of the questions together. Someone was saying yes to your observation about the lack of financial support for a ministry of deacons. And so they wanted you to elaborate on that some about where one might find resources for ministry. And then another person said, how can the church, the big capital C church and the local church support deacons financially as they bridge their work from the church to the world? So any ideas of how deacons move in those spaces?
Well, I'm taking my cue from Dr. Jerome Del Pino, who says some of it has got to come from the Council of Bishops. And they need to be talking in their own conference and saying, look, let's broaden what we're doing with our money, and let's get some deacons out there in those centers of power to represent the church and to work for justice. I think that's part of it. We operate so much of the time from this understanding of scarcity instead of understanding of fullness and wholeness. I think if we can present it to the church right, the church will go, yes, let's do that. That's important. That's exciting. You know, we get so caught up in our political fussing about this and that. But with an exciting idea, the church responds. I think about Africa University, for instance, which actually plays a big part in all of this. It's in the book, but Paul and Joaquin and Rosalie were all very involved in the establishment of Africa University. Paul Van Buren particularly, who had a doctorate in agriculture. And that helped the church to see that diaconal ministers were more than, and I hate to say this about my own work, but more than just children's ministers. Diaconal ministers had all kinds of competencies and possibilities. And we have a university in Africa, people. That's pretty amazing and exciting. And we have supported schools in a variety of places, like Harris Memorial in the Philippines that I mentioned earlier. That's the work of the United Methodist Women. Wow. We can do what we believe in and what we want to do. So part of it, it's making people believe in it, but helping people to believe in it, not making them. But it's complicated because the diaconal or the deacon who feels called to that particular kind of work should not be the one organizing the conference to give the money, because that puts you in a really tough place. So we have to, all of us, the whole order should be working with the CFNA in the conference. Let's get money in there.
Right. For this. Okay, two other questions I think will finish us. Someone says, I experience confusion between the verb to pastor, which we all do, and the noun, title noun, and noun pastor. When we talk about the nomenclature movement from commissioning of deacon and ordination as an elder, I think this concept and title of pastor is confusing. Do you have something to say about this with all your experience?
Yeah, what I always have said is, yes, we are pastoral, but it doesn't make sense to me to be appointed as a pastor unless there is a clear reason for you and your specialized skills and gifts. If the church has lost connection with its community, for instance, a deacon may be exactly who needs to be appointed there for a few years to work as a community organizer and find the places in the community the church needs to be connected to. But just to serve in a general pastoral role as pastor, I think that really confuses the distinctiveness of the two orders, and we need to be careful of that. I do know some deacons have served as church planners and done it well. I think you can make an argument for deacons doing that for their particular calling, but we just have to be careful.
Okay, and then someone says, I struggle with the authority of BOOM, Boards of Ordained Ministry, over all independent ministries of deacons. It can make it feel as though such entrepreneurs are perpetual candidates. Why is this?
So it sounds like that person's BOOM is somehow deciding every year or to whether a deacon's ministry is appropriate. I served on BOOM for 14 years. I was only supposed to be there 12, but I wound up being there 14, and we didn't do that. So I don't know. Somebody else needs to answer that question.
Okay. A couple of folks have asked, so if you could, someone is in the chat says, BOOMs approve appointment sites beyond the local church. I thought that was the bishop's authority, was to approve appointments for deacons beyond. That's been my experience in my annual conference, was that I asked my bishop to approve me to Garrett when I began here.
We have to refer this to Victoria Rebeck or Anita Wood. I don't know.
Okay, it's saying bishops approve. The person writing in the thing says bishops appoint, BOOMs approve. So
oh, that was just kind of pro forma in mine. Oh my goodness, there's a long chat here.
We're getting lots, but that's interesting. That's not been my experience. So
conference relations. Yeah. I would refer that, there are two people I would refer that to, and it's Anita Wood and Victoria Rebeck. You can still reach Anita. She is still doing some work for the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, and you can still reach her. If you just send an email to GBHEM, they'll get it to her.
And then let me just say in the chat, and it may be further back now, but Daniel Smith, who works, I forget Daniel's title at the library, the Steiberg Library at Garrett, but he is a wonderful, Margaret Ann said, helped with the resources for the book and for the presentation. Oh, thank you, Daniel. He's posted it now so that it's at the end. The library has created a guide for deacons that is posted. It's at guides.garrett.edu/UMC Deacon History. But if you go to the Garrett website, you would find it. But a great list of resources. Anita has put her email address in the chat, and Meg has put there's a Deacons at GBHEM address.
Oh, so yeah, great. Thanks, Meg.
Let's end this with Margaret Ann. Several folks have asked, again, the name of your book and where folks can find it.
Yes, it's called Advancing the Mission, the Order of Deacon in the United Methodist Church. I believe that we have been showing a thing where you can pre-order a copy, but it will be posted, I know, on the Deacons Facebook page once it's actually completed. And I'm hoping early summer, I don't know. I was really anxious for it to be out before this anniversary, which is April 24th. And before General Conference, but of course, General Conference is now a long ways off. But deacons, read this story and look what our predecessors did for us. It's the same work still needs to be done, and there's a lot of advice in there about how to get it done. And I also have 4 chapters about the not yet aspect of the Order of Deacon. There are some deep concerns that I think we need to attend to about ourselves. So I hope it will generate good discussion. And you hope you get the book and read it. It's a suspenseful story.
Daniel, once again, thank you so much, has noted that on our event page on the Garrett website, where you found the information about registering today, that there is a page that gives a flyer and information about pre-ordering the book.
Oh,
So,
yeah, and Kathy Armistead just said it'll be available at Amazon and other bookstores, including Barnes and Noble. Wow, thank you, Kathy. And Kathy's the one who said I should write a book, so I did.
And Shannon Conklin Miller has noted that a lot of information of appointments on deacons can be found in the Boom handbook that's available. She's given the link there. So maybe we'll for a few minutes, once we end, we won't immediately close the meeting, so that you can be able to look in the chat if you want to download any of those resources. So I want to thank Leo so much for this morning and this afternoon. We are so appreciative of you being with us. Thank you to Margaret Ann. The story needed to be told, and we are so glad that you have told it. And thank you for being with us at this event. And thank you to all of you who joined us, and hope to see you at the worship service on Saturday. Thank you and good night, or good evening, good afternoon.